Welcome to Dylan Experience. This is episode 28. I'm Dylan, your host. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you go ahead and subscribe, hit the bell notification so you can see me more often. If you're listening to this on any other podcast platform, make sure you follow us, subscribe to me. I'm excited for our next guest. We have a lot to discuss, but my next guest is a Cold War era veteran. He lost his brother's suicide, grew up in a family with a history of mental health issues, struggled with mental health issues himself, eating disorders, even suicide. His military experience basically pushed him to essentially turn off his emotions and disconnect. In the past 2 years, he's really been on a journey, and a really interesting journey when we get into this, of discovery, of healing, trekking across famous places like the Amazon rainforest, the Andes Mountains. And he's connected with meditation, with breath work. He's taken ayahuasca, DMT, other things. We're going to talk about that. But my guest today is Chris Shivers. Chris, how are you, man?
If I was any better, I'd be twins. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and dive into it.
I mean, I've never met someone or talked to someone that has taken some of these things. So I'm super excited to hear like what it was, what it was like. You've got a story to tell. So I'm just going to kind of let you tell me about yourself. Like, how did life happen for you? How did you get to the point where you're talking to me today? Right.
I think I grew up like most 80s babies, 80s, 90s babies, divorced family. We were fortunate. I grew up in a suburb just outside of Houston, and it was pretty affluent. But my mom, like most working moms, she didn't make a lot of money. She didn't have a degree. So she was working an office job making, I don't know what it was back then, but it wasn't much. And we were fortunate that my dad was required to keep the house. So we were able to stay in a very middle income home, but not have a middle income family. So it was always a struggle. I knew we didn't have as much as my friends. I grew up just outside of NASA. And so it was a pretty affluent area. And in the mid 80s, they dubbed it a Suicide Pact. It was proven to be false. They just glamorized it in the press. But my brother was one of four, what essentially became a domino effect, which we've seen happen over and over again. He was the second or third suicide. He was 16. He was a great guy, athletic. He was definitely he got the better genes of the two of us. I have struggled to, he didn't have those struggles, to have a great physique, to have, friends, all those things. But at the end of the day, there was something in him that made him, he hung himself in our garage with two athletic socks. And so I came in, my mom was holding him. He was already deceased. I was 11 at the time, so still old enough to kind of understand, but not fully grasp. And then came the headlines, and my mom was on Good Morning America, and that was kind of her outlet, I guess, to deal with it, as she wanted to get the awareness out there. And he had struggles, and they knew there were struggles, and he was seeing a psychiatrist, and but it still wasn't something that was talked about it was the family secret, it was the elephant in the room that was always there. And it wasn't until recently that I learned kind of how deep that mental health ran in my family, on both sides of my family. And even to the point that when I got married to my first wife, she has a history as well in her family. We never had discussions about it. And now I would, knowing what I know now, I would say maybe it's not a great idea we have kids together, because I've seen a lot of my mental health struggles that I have, that my kids go through the exact same thing. And it's crazy. Obviously the advantage is they get to start talking through that in their 20s, right, if not before, than having to wait till a much later stage in life like I did.
Right. Well, I mean, it's, I mean, so many questions come to mind when you go through like stuff like that, right? Like,
Right.
um, I went through like not exactly the same thing. I lost my dad to suicide at 6.
Mhm.
Now the difference was I never saw him, right? Like he walked out, left, and did it somewhere else. And so I never had to see that. But what what was that like for you? Like at 11 years old to know your brother ended his life, and obviously like you saw that in some capacity, right? What was it like for you?
I mean, I think it was hard. I don't think at 11, I don't think at 20 or 30, it would be difficult enough to deal with that.
Yeah.
But at 11, my brain just couldn't process it. And so it processed in other ways, and I acted out and I was never a horrible kid. My mom was always kind of there to steer me just at the last moment, or talk the cops into let me off with a stern warning and,
Yeah.
cleaning this or cleaning that. So I was always kind of able to ride that fine line. But now looking back and having the advantage of perspective, I have no doubt that I was the damaged kid, in the school, that it was probably we don't want our kid hanging around that kid, especially with the history and with the stigma. I mean, there's still a huge stigma
Mm-hmm.
with suicide, and there's still, I mean, it would be impossible. And it was my biggest fear having children, was that, one of them would struggle. But, I think it would be hard for me not to feel like a failure as a parent if I had that happen, no matter what the situation was. So it was hard. And I mean, it was a big adjustment. And I don't know that I ever really dealt with it until recently, because it hasn't been easy to talk about, or it hasn't been a conversation. Like my wife didn't know the whole story until probably the last 2.5, 3 years.
How long you been married?
We've been together 8, 9 years. So I
Wow.
mean, there was a big chunk in there where, and it wasn't that I hid it. It was, much like the way my father deals with it. He just doesn't talk about it.
Yeah.
If it doesn't come up, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to, because it's hard not to see that mental image.
Mhm.
I mean, it's being honest. It's hard not to have that last thing
Yeah.
be seeing your mom holding your brother. But I choose that if that's the first image I see, then the next image is, he and I playing football, or, him not punching me in the face, or, all the great memories that come along with it. And I have to look at it like I'm lucky. I'm lucky that I got 11 years of having a big brother. And I'm lucky that I got somebody to try to emulate, and hopefully, in some small way, I'm making him proud now. But that doesn't make it any easier not to do a bunch of what ifs, and what would life be like, and
It,
what would it be like to have uncles, to be an uncle, and
right.
all those things that come along, because he was my only brother. So
Yeah. And it's not just it's not just a simple process from going from, I grieving to I'm lucky to have had 11 years.
yeah,
Going from like that's like shifting a car from reverse to drive and
right.
expecting you to be going 70 miles an hour, right? So tell me about that. Like what opened your eyes to needing to heal, or needing to grieve, or needing to kind of get to that level of being able to look at your brother and say, I love that I had 11 years with you.
I think it was a lot of things. I mean, I think for most people that are on a, whatever you want to call it, a healing journey, or, the process, for me, it was about learning about myself. It was just really figuring myself out. And there were just all these really tiny steps along the way that led to this discovery. And some of them hugely profound, and some of them really minuscule. And um, when you talk about working with plant medicine, the big thing that they always talk about is integration. You have to integrate, you have to work. And really all that is those things that you discover through the medicine, you then have to take home and put them into action. It's like I'm an entrepreneur and I have a business. I can have the greatest service in the world, but if nobody knows it's there, then what does it mean?
Yeah.
If I've done all this self-discovery and I know myself better than anybody else, but I don't put any of it into play, and it doesn't help improve any of my relationships, then kind of what was it for? Um, but I think one of my and my I was married to a very negative person, just typically had a negative spin for whatever reason. And my wife is very positive. She just kind of sees everything with a glass half full. So it took several years of trying to continually reprogram that mindset of looking at the glass being half full instead of being half empty to try to start to see those things. And one of the greatest examples is I tell her all the time, I wish we had gotten to spend our 20s together. I wish I had gotten to spend our 30s together. And she says all the time, I wasn't ready for you. Like I wasn't ready to handle this. And that's true. Yeah. And I mean, that's just how I look at everything. Like I wasn't ready. We were in the car the other night and I said, can you imagine if I'd have started this journey 10 years ago, like where I would be now? And then I think I wasn't ready. I didn't see the signs. I didn't think I was doing anything other than life. And I was just doing it with blinders on, feeling nothing, experiencing nothing, right. Trying to chase the next big up, or the next big endorphin boost. Instead of just celebrating the wins. But I had a really profound moment this summer when I kind of made the whole connection with the, what's wrong? Because we had been in Austin, it's a couple hours drive. I'm in Dallas, and we had gone to do a Wim Hof retreat. I don't know if you know who that is.
Yep. Absolutely.
Breath work and cold water submersion. My wife's gotten really involved in it. She has some medical autoimmune stuff and it helps her. And so we went and the instructor was using an example. If you were out in the desert and your worst enemy, the person that's done you wrong in the world more than anybody else, was walking through the desert with a glass of water and you had been out there for 2 days, what would you feel in that moment? And she said, you would feel happy. No matter how you felt about that person, you would feel happiness in that moment. And we were driving home and I couldn't correlate. I couldn't make the connection on what that would feel like. And then I started thinking, when was the last time I was happy? Not content, not like really joyfully happy. And I couldn't pick out a time or a place that I had been. And then it was like dominoes just falling into place that it started to all make sense, that I was unable to feel happy because I had figured out how to turn off sad. And so the only thing that I would allow to get through was anger, because that was the only emotion, as a man, as a dad, as a husband, that was acceptable for me to show, and that's how I expressed everything, was in anger. And it wasn't until I figured out, okay, why do I not feel happy, that I realized I also don't feel sad. Like I don't make that connection. I don't process through it. It's basically it was shove it in the corner, and hope it never rears its ugly head again.
Super relatable, right? I feel like a lot of people I talk to, and a lot of people not just clients, but also like on this podcast, have said something similar, right? In terms of like, but I don't think many people have kind of made that connection of
right.
Not only just not feeling happiness, but not feeling everything else.
Right.
And it kind of reminds me of, I want to say it was Alan Watkins, long time ago, YouTube video. I think it was a TED Talk or something similar. He talked about like most people only know 12 emotions, or feel like the average of 12 emotions, and they can't really express anything beyond that. They can't recognize, or don't have the ability to recognize what more than those 12 emotions, like things like happiness, sadness, anger, maybe frustration, annoyance, right? They could name 12 that they feel consistently. But the reality is that like, if you look in the English language, right, thousands of emotions exist. Right. And it's, with my work and what I talk about, really connecting people to what they're really feeling is such a challenge for so many people, because they just don't have, whether it's the vocabulary or the self-awareness to actually recognize that this is what I'm actually feeling.
Right.
Like oftentimes it's like they feel love, but really it's empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And that can become super dangerous, because you're actually applying an action word that is completely different than what the action word you're talking about is. Love,
right,
to me, is like this action without expectation. Like, I want to give to you for no absolute reason other than I appreciate you.
Right.
Whereas empathy is, I want to listen to you. I want to understand you. And so when you start looking at these different emotions and these feelings, if you start confusing them, your body's becoming disconnected from what the reality of those emotions really are. And it's remarkable to hear you talk about this, because I don't think I've heard it yet on the podcast, of making that connection and how important it is.
Right.
You know?
Right.
It's really interesting to hear that. I'm glad you're going down this line.
Well, because you can't have a yin without the yang. You can't have the sunrise without the sunset. I mean,
Right.
you can't have both. And and what I found is things were bothering me, or things would come out, if my wife and I had a disagreement, it wasn't what she said or did in the moment that was bothering me. It was something that I hadn't processed from an hour ago. It was something a client said to me. It was something, that I was, most times, more often than not, it's frustration with myself that I don't know how to process and I don't know how to deal with.
Oh my gosh.
What I was finding is, an hour later, I was like, why was I even upset about that? And so I started like, hey, I just need like an hour to process this. I just need an hour to work through this emotion and figure out where I'm at with it. And now it's gotten to where I don't want to say it's instantaneous, but it's pretty close. I could be like, whoa, wait a sec. I think this is not why I'm upset in this moment.
Yeah.
It's, something that my kid said to me earlier, or something that, a friend said to me, whatever the case may be.
It's pretty remarkable how quickly that transformation can happen when you start actually paying attention to what matters.
Right. Right.
It's really remarkable.
But I started what I really loved is I started paying closer attention to my thought processes and what my thought process was. And I learned that, my thought process is always to go to worst case scenario. So if you told me you were going to be my headset doesn't work when we start the podcast, it's ruined. He's going to be pissed. He's going to be like, why did I even book this guy? Why? That's where my thought process would have gone before. Great example of this one takes a minute, but I have anxiety with travel, with flying, not
Sure.
Plane crash. I just don't like the people. I don't like being in that confined space.
Yeah.
All those things that go along with air travel. And so I had never traveled internationally. I had never gone, other than to Tijuana, I had never left the country. And so to get on a plane and go to Peru by myself was a daunting task. And I didn't know anybody on the other end, other than just like Facebook communications and stuff like that. So about a week before I left, I had kind of made friends with the guys, and it was a men's retreat. And so we had some introductions and stuff, and they were like, hey, are you okay? Like bringing my wife a phone. I want to get her a new phone, because the customs there, it's difficult to get stuff through. I'm like, absolutely, no problem. And then they're like, can you bring some seeds? Like, just go to Lowe's for the garden, just grab a bunch of seeds. I'm like, yeah, no worries. I can do that. And so then I'm thinking about it. I'm like 2 days away from leaving, and I Google, is it okay to travel with seeds? And it's like, you cannot bring plants or plant products into the country.
Yeah.
Dude, my brain immediately goes to, I'm like going through customs, like this big red light goes off and they send me down this other walkway. I go down into this dungeon.
For some seeds.
For some seeds. Not just, hey, hey, what are you doing with these? Oh, my buddy's got a garden. He's trying to plant some tomatoes. Hey, you can't bring these in, and he tosses them.
Yeah.
No, that's not where it went. But what I found was, even as I'm telling the story, my body would go through that
Yeah.
emotion. So I would literally experience that anxiety
Yep.
and experience what it would do to my body, whether it was real or not, because I have such a great imagination.
Yep.
I'm using it essentially for evil instead of using it for good. But yeah, when I started recognizing things like that, but here comes the funny one, is I didn't even make the connection. The day before I left, I hadn't really told my parents, and when I say my parents, my dad, I have a great stepmom. I was blessed with a wonderful stepmom who's raised me since I was 6. And so she deserves the moniker mom as well. But we went to lunch, and my wife's like, you got to tell them you're going to Peru. And so like 3 weeks before, I was like, hey, so I'm going to Peru for a couple of weeks, and just glossed right over it, right? Like the 14-year-old version of me would have done, in high school. And so we just ended up not being able to connect. And we went to lunch the day before I left. And so I hope they don't hear this. They're going to be horrible.
It's not a big podcast. So
yeah. So my parents bring me this envelope, and it's literally like it's the name, it's the embassy, it's the who's the head of the embassy, what happens if you're taken to jail in a foreign country, all these things. And I'm just like, thanks. And so we get in the car, and this is where I just love perspective. My wife looks at me and goes, geez, so do you think your dad has the same thought process that you do? He's convinced you're going to get hijacked and kidnapped by, drug smugglers while you're there. Yep. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like it didn't even. And sure enough, we've since talked several times, and he has, and I always knew he had anxiety. He got to the point where he couldn't drive on the highway, which is pretty debilitating. And he was a salesman, so he was always on the road. And then through that discovery and talking through that, my grandmother also had, they called it panic attacks back then, but she had debilitating anxiety as well. And I'm like, maybe we should have talked about that in my 20s, instead of
younger.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say, because like you don't want to have the conversation in terms of diagnosis, I don't think. Or at least that's my experience, right? From what I do, and I'm a mental health coach. I talk to people on all ends of the spectrum in terms of like, did I have a diagnosis when I was a kid, or did I not? Right? Like I never did. I pretty sure I had PTSD after my dad died. Pretty sure I had depression. Pretty sure I probably had anxiety in some ways, if not more. I have no idea. Right? I've never had those diagnoses. I don't think I need them now. But what I've seen is that if you talk about diagnosis with a child, oftentimes that almost becomes a death sentence in a way. And they don't have an understanding of how to process through it, especially with how it's delivered. Right? It just seems like all the stories I hear about diagnosing a child as a child, it's not delivered, right? Because kids don't have the language. They don't have the vocabulary to understand what you're actually talking about. And so if you try to express the gravity of what a diagnosis of whether it's anxiety or more, right? They don't have the capacity in many ways to understand what you're actually exposing them to. Right. And so I think it's really hard to outright come out and say, here's the diagnosis, but I absolutely think it is important to have the conversation about the feeling.
Yeah.
And that is such a challenging thing to do as a parent, right? I'm a stepdad, right? I've been a stepdad for, going on probably about 6 years now. And it's a challenge, right? Because it's, you as a parent, you have to be very self-aware, right? Right. And as a step parent, I think it's even more challenging because I have to be aware of my partner's issues, but also not to a point where I'm like judging them or making them feel right. Like you've got to be tactical about it. Right. And so you have to be able to help them be self-aware and help them kind of understand like, hey, here's your issues, here's the child's issues.
Right.
What do you think about that? Right. Like, and be gentle with it, because it's your partner. You're going to be with her for, the
Right.
rest of your life. And so it's a challenge. It's a really big challenge. And I don't think a lot of people, one, are even self-aware,
Right.
let alone have the ability to, have had the practice to say, what do you think about this remarkably similar situation with your child and you?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's hard.
It
Very
is,
hard.
but I think once you kind of get it out there and you kind of address the elephant in the room, I think it's easier. And I'm a step parent too, and I'm a step parent, and I had all girls, and he's the only biological boy in the house, so it's been it was a struggle, navigating that, and he's 16 now, and we're still navigating it. But I mean, a good example, we had an ice day here Sunday, and he had to go to work, and so I'm going to give him a ride to work because I got 4-wheel drive, and so we hop in, and no worries, I drive him to work, and we get there, and we're getting close, and there's no cars in the parking lot, and I'm thinking, this is not a good sign. And we get up there, and sure enough, the door's locked, and he gets on his phone, and he's like, they don't open till for another hour. They pushed it back an hour. Okay. So we go home, sit there for 45 minutes, get back here. And so I was frustrated, obviously. Yep. And he didn't say anything. And so that night when he got home, I said, hey, I feel like what I need in that moment is just an acknowledgement of, hey, I screwed up. Hey, my bad. I screwed up. I should have looked. And I said, in your defense, I should have said too, hey, what? But I said, I know in that moment, in that, as I'm processing through my emotions, just as simple, I said, because then there's nowhere else for me to go, because I'm not going to pile on to you. I don't want to make you feel worse than you did. I just need an acknowledgement of, hey, I understand that I goofed this up. My bad. I'll try to check it next time so it doesn't happen again. And then I'm usually good to go. But having those conversations and just really saying like, hey, if you do this, then I'll do this. It makes it so much easier. But recognizing kind of the things he does, and he just feels bad, right? And he doesn't know how to express that. He clams up because that's what he knows and what he does. But I thought of something when you mentioned the spouse and the step kid. Is I found that some of the traits that I find so endearing in my wife and so loving and just amazing in him, they're like the ones that are just like nails on a chalkboard. You know what I mean? For whatever reason, like some of those same tendencies are the ones that just, for whatever reason, I don't know why.
Wow, I'm gonna have to think on that one. That's a really interesting thought, because I feel remarkably similar to that.
Yeah. And I can't tell you why. It's not anything, but for whatever reason, I don't know.
No, but going back to what you were saying before, that's definitely something I want to think about. But that's a fundamental conversation you had with him, right? Like the ability to say like, hey, I need you to communicate in this moment, right? For next time, it's not about making him feel bad. You as a parent are taking responsibility and saying, when this kind of thing happens, it helps when you offered this. Right. And it's not about like, you were supposed to know this kind of thing. Like, what's wrong with you? You're supposed to do better. It's like, how can you expect a child to do better if you haven't had these conversations to say consistently? And I think that's the key. Right. Like, consistently say, remember, when we're in this situation, it's important to do this. Right. Because the more you do it, the more they actually do it themselves. Yep. It's not just a one and done kind of thing, because kids don't always learn that way. Kids learn by watching, and they learn by processing things over and over and over and over and over again, and breaking those habits that were created from, negative spaces, or necessity, right?
Right.
So I love that. I love that you have the capacity to understand that you're frustrated, but also come back and say, this is important here. Right. And not, not pump the brakes and say, the fuck is wrong with you? Where a lot of parents do that.
Right. I did. I mean, I did it often.
There's certainly times where I'm like, I'm thinking it, right? I don't ever express it because I know how like hurtful that becomes.
Right.
But I absolutely catch myself thinking it like, no. And I am self-aware, and it's that instantaneous of like, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to say that to him. And it's parenting is a challenge. And I think like step parent,
hardest job in the world.
Right. I mean, absolutely.
Unquestionably, especially like, I don't know, like we split time, but then dad moved. And so he's, it's 24/7, which I love him and I wouldn't, it's great. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do. I mean, it really is, because you have so much say, but you don't have ultimate say.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
it's almost like you have say, but you also have no say at all.
Exactly.
At times.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you kind of know that. And for me, when I first kind of became a step parent, I had to come to terms with the fact that at some point my son's going to say, you're not my real dad.
Right.
And like that mindset, I think really helped me understand that I'm not trying to be your real dad, and that I have no expectations of wanting to be your real dad.
Right.
I am me. I'm always going to be me. And I want you to be who you want to be.
Right.
And so if you don't want to do what I say, understand, number one, there's consequences. There's always going to be consequences, whether it's good or bad.
Right.
And that's going to determine what you do. Right. There's going to be consequences to those consequences. And I know that.
Right.
But what I want, and kind of how I've built my relationship with my son, and I call him my son. I don't, I only use the term stepson to clarify the relationship here.
Right.
But it's always been about communication, right? Because if I can't communicate with him and he can't communicate with me, what are we really doing? What are we growing? What are we building?
Right.
Nothing. And so I want to be able to, even if he does something wrong, I want him to be able to communicate with me. That's why I don't judge him when he does something wrong. In fact, many times I applaud him for making a mistake, because now I have the opportunity to help you learn something that if you hadn't made the mistake, we wouldn't have been able to learn.
Right.
And it's a challenge, right? It's not always comfortable. It's conflict, and it's not fun because emotion, right? But it's also, like being a step parent, it's also a remarkably beautiful thing to watch a human being that's not your son become your son, right? Like, and likewise for a daughter, if that's what you have, and to realize like the way that you operate is just becoming so like they love you because of you.
Right. And
to watch that process is just so, I think it's the most beautiful thing in the world. It might be the hardest thing in the world, but it's beautiful.
Well, and no matter how much somebody says it's the most difficult job in the world, or you're marrying the kids as well, like you don't fully understand that until you're in it. I mean, it's true. You just don't get that perspective until you're knee deep. But it's a great thing to watch. And what's funny with him is he shares a lot of my same personality traits, even though we're not related. He's very emotional. 2 years ago, I guess it would have been pre-COVID, he did the same thing I do. He has a teacher that was a coach, and he was stressing him down in front of the class. I don't remember what it was, over a grade or over something. And he's kind of dogging him out in front of the class, and he starts tearing up. and then he starts making fun of him. Why are you crying? Why are you, you're a baby. We ended up having a parent teacher conference, and I was still at the height of my emotion, and I went in there and my voice cracked, and I was like, you're fixing to see emotion, and it's got nothing to do with weakness. And I told him, I said, and I was so glad I got the opportunity to. I said, don't ever let them take that away from you. Like, that's your strength, you being able to show that emotion and being confident in that emotion. And I said, I shut it off. And this was long before my journey. So I even realized it at the time. And I said, that's your superpower, being able to show that emotion and tap into that emotion. Don't ever let them turn it off. And he hasn't, and he's learned to manage it. And he's a great kid. And I mean, so in touch. Like, I'm like, dude, you're like, and he's still immature in some ways. He's a teenager, but he's easily, like, we joke all the time, like, I was not as self-aware as he was, at that
crazy?
age. That's so crazy. I mean, I was that kid,
Yeah.
I mean, we were doing just dumb run. I stole a car and went to Florida, from Houston to Florida at 14 years old. I'm like, my little one is 1 year younger than I was when I stole a truck. I mean, it's just,
I don't feel like we have enough time for the stories.
oh my gosh. Yeah,
Chris.
there's so many. And most of the great part is, most of them I didn't instigate. I was just along for the ride. Along for the ride.
I feel like there's going to be a part 2 to this one. Just a honest opinion here. I feel like there's going to be definitely a part 2 to this podcast. I feel like we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there is a lot.
Oh man, it is crazy to kind of look at, because I'm a social media influencer. I don't know how much you have done if you've done any research about me.
I did.
We connected on Facebook, obviously, from a veteran group. For those who are listening, I have watched social media grow up, right? And so have you. But I've actually become part of that social media growing up, as I have built a platform on TikTok with now over 560,000, which is absolutely insanity for me. And I see things, right? Like, I see culture like completely transforming from what I grew up in, 25 years ago when my dad died. And looking at how suicide was looked at then, right? I'm sure you can attest to this, and how suicide was looked at with your brother. And seeing just a complete, like, almost a complete 180 on self-awareness, right? Like a complete 180 on mental health and things like things within that realm of how do we look at people. Certainly there's still stigma. There's still assholes in the world. There's still people that would, dog people for feeling emotions and stuff like that. But what I see on social media has, like, there has never been a time in human history where we have talked like about everything like we do now. Right.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's, I remember being a kid, and it was trendy to go to rehab. It was trendy to go to, they were pumping the insurance companies for all they were worth, making money off these families. And, my parents threatened to send me, hey, we're going to, this is where you're going to do inpatient and do all these things. But we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it at school. I didn't, and even in my house, my kids are acutely aware, and we talk about it, and they've had friends that have attempted, and they have, they've known people that have committed suicide. I mean, it's a part of everyday life. And I think the saddest thing with a teenager is they just don't have perspective. They just don't have the perspective to know that whatever they're going through, no matter how intense it is today, it just may not be as intense tomorrow. But I think when you're talking about true mental health, I think most of those people are, they've been sick for a long time. It's not just it's not just a breakup, or it's that whatever, that nagging feeling.
Trauma.
You know? Yeah.
I think trauma has such a huge impact that we don't even understand. And we don't even know what trauma, like, I don't think society really understands what trauma is, because trauma is relative.
Right.
Right. What's traumatic to you and I might be completely different for my 10-year-old.
Right.
Right. And a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old and a newborn. Right. Even birth is trauma. Right. And so, like, I think that's a discussion that is part of the future, is like, we look at trauma, and I think people still kind of look at it and say, that's not trauma. Right. Like, that's not enough. Like, you can't call that trauma. Right. But the reality is that trauma is a relative idea, and that in itself can be dangerous, because, then we can create anything as traumatic, and then, like, even words then become traumatic.
Right.
But regardless, it's not necessarily a conversation on, like, the depth of trauma, but it's a conversation as to how do we have the conversation about trauma.
Right.
And I think right now in human, the human history of communication and conversation, like, we are in the best place we've ever been to open up conversations about these topics. And it almost feels like the conversations are happening so fast that we're almost getting ahead of ourselves, right? We don't actually know how to structure these conversations, let alone have the technology to study the conversations, that are bringing up the science and bringing up the ideas.
Right.
And social media is a very interesting kind of position or thing to watch when we're having these conversations about things like trauma and things like mental health and suicide, right? Like, when you and I grew up, like, where could we go?
Right.
Kids now, a 10-year-old can have a phone.
Right.
And guess where I am? I'm on that phone, right? Like, I never had someone like me that openly talked about trauma, openly talked about suicide, that openly talked about emotions and feelings and things like that, and have podcasts like this available at the palm of your hands when I was 10 years old.
Right.
If I had, would I have gone through what I had gone through beyond 10? Maybe not. That's the remarkable thing in my eyes, and looking at, like, what I do and where, the many people that I've had on this podcast and beyond, the many people I've connected with on TikTok and Instagram, Facebook, all over the place. Access to information has changed the game in terms of how we have these conversations. And it's remarkable to me. People are obviously still going to suffer, but it's, how do we get that information to the people that are struggling with it?
Right.
How do we identify them? How do we get that information to them? How do we determine the righteousness of that information? Right. Like, because I'm not a qualified mental health professional, but I certainly still help people.
Right.
Right. And so it's all very interesting to kind of think about and contemplate. And that's why we have conversations like this to discuss that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's all very interesting to me to dig into that and see where we've come, because you and I, we came from a different generation of talking about suicide. And trust me, your story, it was same thing, right? It was like, brush my father's suicide under the rug, because we don't act like that ever happened.
Right.
We don't know how to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, and God forbid we call it a sickness, or say, hey, he was sick, or hey, they weren't well. Because again, I think it's for me, or even for a spouse, I would assume you feel some level of responsibility, and therefore some level of blame.
Yeah.
And so the easiest way to deal with that is just to not talk about it. After my brother died, I went into, my parents put me into therapy. I had a therapist which, I went to for years. But it still wasn't talked about. We still didn't talk about it at the dinner table. My dad didn't say, "Oh, I had a really stressful day. This happened. This is what I did to deal with it." None of those things. And there was no conversation of, like, "Hey, what's your thought process? Like, what are you thinking about?" Like, I think, and I would have to go back and really think about it, but I thought about suicide a lot, like thinking about it now. And it wasn't, and I attempted suicide several times, but it was never a serious attempt. It wasn't, the gun jammed or, and I understand and realize now that they were more about seeking attention than they were anything. But that's still, to be at that level of, "Hey, I need attention," that's a pretty severe cry for help. But it wasn't until about a year ago, my second oldest one, and she's had struggles as well, even though on the outside, she's finished her bachelor's degree in 3 years, getting her master's now, already has a job lined up. On the looking from the outside looking in, is an amazing person, but struggles like so many do. And wasn't until I was in the car and I asked her, we were just driving down the road, and I said, "Do you think about suicide?" And she's like, "Oh yeah." And I was like, "More than like once a day?" She's like, "Yeah, a couple of times." I said, "Just kind of in passing?" And she's like, "Yep." And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, I know exactly. And she was like, "You do the same thing?" And I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "I've never met anybody else that feels that way." And I said, "Well, one, how many people have you asked?
Right.
And two, like, who else would feel that way but me?"
Right.
Like, it's just, but it was that realization, that aha for her of, "Oh my gosh, somebody else feels this way." And it's not a serious, I'm going to sit and, meditate on whether I'm going to take my life. It's it goes back to that worst case scenario thing that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I'm having a bad day. I got in a fight. Well, I can always just veer the truck and run into that freaking concrete pylon, then no problems anymore.
Yeah.
But even that, again, you're sending something through your body and through your mind, and throwing it into a negative space. This was the first year through the holidays that we got to the end of it. And I was like, I didn't think about it at all. It never even crossed my mind. And that was,
it's been a while, if I'm being honest. Like, I don't know if I remember the last time I felt it, which is remarkable considering from 6 to 25 every day.
Right.
If I wasn't thinking about my dad's suicide, I was thinking about how I could commit suicide.
Right.
And in 2015, when I almost committed suicide, and I got about as close as I could come, right? I was a millimeter away from pulling that trigger completely, right? I had all the slack pulled out of my Glock 34. From that moment on, I worked, right? You went on your journey, I went on mine.
Right.
And it's remarkable to start thinking about, I didn't have, my mom still has never talked to me whether I've never asked her the question. Like, I look at myself now, I'm like, fuck, I've never asked her that question. Right. And oftentimes I think of myself as, I'm in a situation, I'm in a position of like, I'm here to understand people's mental health. And one of the most important people in my life was my mom. Right. I never asked her, right? She never asked me. Or maybe she did, and I don't remember. But even back then, before 25, I never would have answered her. Right. I never would have gave her, the real thought of like, people ask you, how are you? And I ask, when was the last time you actually gave an honest answer? And if you don't have an answer, you might want to start thinking about that. Right. And why you feel that way. And it's a pretty powerful thing to recognize that someone else is going through at least something similar.
Right.
That's why I think a lot of people really connect with me, It's because I talk about all the things that are so relatable to everybody else. Like, hey,
Right.
have you ever felt like you wanted to commit suicide all the time? Holy cow. 550,000 people have thought about it too. Like,
Right.
it's not uncommon.
No.
And it's not, depression is not uncommon. Anxiety is not uncommon, especially in today's society where we are so technology focused and so fast. Everything is so fast that you almost have to be anxious because you have to catch things before they happen.
Right.
Because if they happen so fast, you could be, you're driving 75 miles down the road. Like, if you're not anxious, like you could die.
Right.
And so because of that speed of life, it's almost necessary because our prehistoric, processing of our brain is not updated to, the way people operate nowadays.
Right.
And the way society operates nowadays. And it's really interesting to kind of look at that kind of disconnect between how we think and how we act.
Yeah.
And then, you bringing in the idea of thinking creates feelings, so remarkable to, if you haven't thought about it, and I'm really hoping people connect with this podcast episode specifically because of that. When you really think about it, every thought creates a feeling.
Yeah.
Every thought evokes an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you recognize it or not is up to you. It's up to your consciousness. And it's important to track those and kind of trace those thoughts back to the origin of them,
Yeah. And feeling follows action, right?
I
mean, you see it time and time again. So,
right.
No, I totally agree.
Man, we have so much to talk about. I feel like we're not going to get to all of it, but I do want to get to, I want to tell me about the rainforest. Tell me about the Andes. Tell me about like that part, obviously that's where you kind of got into ayahuasca. I would imagine that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
So tell me about that stuff.
So I'll take you back and kind of where the whole idea started. I've always been called, I didn't know what it meant to be called, but I've always been called to altered state of reality. Even as a kid,
sure.
When I experimented, it was always with mind altering. It was never no heroin, no cocaine, nothing, no speed. I didn't like speed. Cannabis, and the only thing that was available at the time was LSD. So okay. I did quite a bit of LSD.
No shrooms or anything like that?
No. I didn't know. Like I'd heard, hey, you can go pick these out and I remember one time we walked through a field looking for them, but I didn't even know what I was looking for. Sure. I would have thought it was
probably a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now that I know, how many dangerous species
there's a lot of them.
Yeah. You definitely don't want to be out there just randomly picking things up and eating them.
Yeah.
But I went in the Marine Corps, and again, goes back to worst case scenario. I didn't touch anything. I was paranoid when I was in. I drank, but I wouldn't even drive when I was drinking. Wouldn't touch anything because I didn't want to get caught. And then really wasn't called to anything. And I guess about 3 years ago, I saw a post from a veteran group that I'm in. And there's a guy named Stephen Kuhn. I don't know if you know who that is.
It sounds familiar.
Stephen Kuhn and Lane Balone, they wrote this book called The Humble Alpha. And they had gone to Peru and done this journey. And I was just like, whoa, this is something that's always piqued my interest. Like, what is this? And so I started researching it and started looking into it. And, kind of became friends with those guys. And about this time last year, Lane had gone and done like a men's retreat. And, they did like some cold water submersion, and they took psilocybin. So they took mushrooms.
Yep.
And I texted him and I was like, what do I got to do to get invited to the next one of those? Like, what do I got to do to make that happen? And he's like, I think you just did. And from there, we put together 4 vets got together in Colorado. We took psilocybin, and it was the thing. I call it my awakening day. It was the day that kicked in the door for me, where and it was the first domino that fell, and then they just started falling from there at a rapid pace. But I left there and I was like, wow, there's more to this. Like, this is what I'm called to do. And I knew they were going back to Peru in the spring. But we had just lost my mother-in-law to COVID. And my wife is unbelievably supportive. But she said, I've never asked you to do anything, but can you not go this trip? Like, I just lost my mom. The thought of losing you, would not be good. Can you just not go now? And so I obviously respected that and said, absolutely. And I knew on some level I needed to go by myself. I knew that I needed to go and experience that. So I made a connection through Lane and Steven to a guy in Cusco, who then led me to a guy in the Amazon. And they were both putting on a men's retreat. It was a little longer. It was about 3.5 weeks all in. And it was 12 days in the Amazon, and then 10 days in Cusco, so 10 days in the Andes. And so we did ayahuasca. We did 5 journeys over 6 nights. And it's I didn't know anything about this till I got there. It's a Shipibo, the shaman or Shipibo. So it's a traditional Shipibo ceremonies. So they sing what are called ikaras, and they're prayers, and they sing them to you as you're journeying on the ayahuasca. And an ayahuasca journey can last anywhere from 2 hours to 6 hours. So you can imagine that you're in this state, and there's a woman singing to you, like singing over you, praying over you for hours on end. Wow. It's intense. And the first night, after the first night, they bring us back in, and we met with the shaman. And all he had to say was that I had a lot of darkness. Not that I was evil, but there was a lot of darkness there. And over the next 4 nights, or over the next 4 journeys, by the 5th night, he essentially cracked open my skull and pulled the darkness out. And at that moment, the anxiety was gone, the worry was gone. It was just a feeling of, okay, this is what it's supposed to feel like. And from that point on, it's a work, it's not, and it was difficult. And I think I did what a lot of people do when I came back, and I was in that, they call it the afterglow, right? You come back and all the food tastes great. Everything
I'm healed.
Is beautiful. Yeah, I'm good. And it wasn't until about 3 weeks later that my wife's like, you're not doing any of your modality stuff anymore. Like, you're literally just getting up in the morning, heading out the door. And she said, I can start feeling a change. And she was right. And I had to go back, and that's when I really started my integration piece of, okay, I need to start figuring out what is this integration, and what did I learn, and what could I put it into play. But we left the Amazon and felt great. I mean, we had no cell phones. I would get an update every couple of days on kind of, hey, your family's good. Nancy's great. But otherwise, no communication with the outside world, which was huge. No TV, no radio. Yeah. I mean, you were sitting there thinking, processing, and obviously interacting with each other and talking through stuff with each other. But that was probably as big a piece of it as the medicine. Yeah. Was being able to sit there and process and think through that stuff. But we left there and then went to Cusco and did journeyed on San Pedro 3 times over 4 days, which that's a very, so they call ayahuasca grandmother, and then they call San Pedro grandfather. And so the way it's always been explained to me is grandmother is very like put you in the clouds, and grandfather kind of grounds you more. But for me, the ayahuasca was more kind of the deep work, the going in and figuring out where the shadows are and addressing them. And then the San Pedro was more about figuring out kind of how do I show up? What do I want to look like, as a man, as a person? And, I think it's the struggle that we all have. What is my legacy? What am I leaving behind? Especially going through COVID, because I've lost, friends of friends that were healthy on the outside and everything looked great. And then, it's the older I get, the more I see that through COVID and, just through natural means that nothing's guaranteed. And what do I leave? And if I can't, I'm not going to ever be rich. I'm not going to leave my kids life-changing money anyways. But if I can leave them with a better understanding of who they are and why they do the things they do, and maybe accelerate their awareness by 20 or 30 years, then that, to me, they can make their own money. There's more money out there to be had, but there's only one money. Yeah, there's only one understanding yourself.
Yeah.
So it was, it was huge, and it was life-changing. After the 5th night, we went for a walk, and I cried, for the first time in a long time. And it wasn't till I heard my wife's voice that I really broke down and wept and had a really good cry. And now I cry. They laugh at me because I cry. I hate saying this. Since I was a kid, I've always loved pro wrestling. That's been my one, sure, dirty secret type thing. And I don't watch it as much as I used to, but there's one event that they do every year called the Royal Rumble. And it's like they send one guy in every 3 minutes, and it's this big pageantry. Yeah. And so I'm watching it, and they're telling the story of these 2 guys that are going to fight, and they've been friends this whole time. And And next thing I know, I'm literally like, and I know it's fake and I know it's scripted, I'm literally like tearing up watching this. And instead of being like mad at myself, I'm like, yes, this is so amazing that I'm totally okay with this.
It's interesting because I've never gotten into like loving pro wrestling, but when I watch it, I can't stop watching.
Right.
And it almost reminds me of like the Greek drama, and the amphitheater of
oh yeah,
acting, and it's not real, but it's not fake enough to say it's worthless,
right?
Because there's something there. There's like it's so interesting to kind of look at that and be like, because it's funny that you say, I hate to say this. I hate to share my guilty secret, but let's be real. It's not a guilty secret. Everybody kind of wants to watch it.
Right.
It's weird, but it's like, it's funny that you it's something that people would judge.
Yeah.
Realistically, it's $1 million business.
Right. Yeah.
It's
yeah. It's a global empire.
Exactly. The Rock didn't come from nowhere.
Right. Exactly.
Some of these actors that we have today didn't come from nowhere. They came from pro wrestling.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to kind of see that. But it's, again, there's always going to be a place for acting, and there's always going to be a place for it, because drama is drama. Yeah. And it's a way to connect with feelings. It's a way to connect with emotions. And I like listening to all of your story, and listening to all of this it's really incredible to kind of see that, because, I've always been I don't want to say I'm a science guy, but I connect with the science more than I connect with the lucid kind of dream-like, alternate reality kind of visual.
Right.
And I've always heard of things like psychedelics and, psilocybin and ayahuasca, and all of those things are really interesting to me because they're successful.
Right.
Right. and it's interesting that they're, in a way controlled or like illegal, because they're successful at working with trauma in some way, right? Are there studies that have come out? I don't know. I haven't done the research on it, but I know there are people like you. I have friends that have gone through like psilocybin journeys, that they worked for them. They legitimately work in whatever way, right? However the science wants to look at it, like, because they need to look at it, it fucking works.
Well, the way that I understand it with the psilocybins, and I'm not a scientist. I'm a Marine, so I'm going to Barney
That's
everything.
Okay. We're good.
But it's actually you are basically programming the neuron pathways in your brain when you consume psilocybins. And MAPS is doing extensive research. They've already gone through the second trial, and the results they're seeing are staggering using psilocybins and MDMA. I mean, we won't be talking about it like this in 10 years. It'll be just the norm, and we'll laugh just like we laugh about 10 years ago. I mean, if you'd have told me I was going to fly into Colorado and be able to go buy pre-rolled joints, I'd have laughed at you. But I mean, that's now our reality. So to think that it's going to get out, and it's getting out, and it's going to get more and more. And I think, like you said, what it really does is you can get the same thing through therapy. You can get the same thing through, working through it. I think it just accelerates it. It just really forces you to sit. And when you said earlier about when you talked about the suicide and how much your thought process was revolved around that, I wanted to pause you and ask, what do you think about now? Like, what does that, and what was that process like? Because that's what I'm actually working on now, is how do I, if I know this is a thought process that I don't want, how do I reprogram so that my default is something else?
What's interesting about that question of what do you think about now? I've asked myself that at times, and I've paid attention. Like, I asked myself that about 2 years ago when I first started the TikTok journey. And I'm like, because people are going to ask me, like, what do you think about? And there's legitimately times where I think about nothing. And it's probably the first time in my life where I've ever actually been able to say that with honesty.
Right.
And say, sometimes I don't think anymore, because I know I don't have to.
Right.
But when I do, I have become a fucking overthinking genius in terms of how I operate, right? Because I run a business, I run a podcast, I do the TikTok, I'm everywhere, right? I've written a book, I've done all of it, right? I've done all the things, and I'm doing more of the things. But there are times where I say, nope, I don't need to think. And to have that ability to control yourself, because it requires control. It requires you to say, I don't need to solve problems that don't exist.
Right.
And it's crazy to me. Like, if you would have told me that, like, ask me 10 years, in 10 years, you're going to be able to control your mind to say, you don't want to think about things right now.
Right.
I would have been like, get the fuck out. Like, you're crazy.
Right.
I know I'm crazy, but you're crazy.
Right.
And now, it's not dissociation. It's not like putting things aside. I legitimately say, there's nothing I need to prioritize right now that I need to think about. And you know what? I can clear my mind.
Right.
And I can just say, let's just sit with it. Right. Let's just be in this moment. Let's just notice everything around me. Let's recognize the world in which I am right now. And it's like being present with myself and allowing myself to, allow my thoughts to disperse through the world rather than disperse within myself.
Right.
And even then I can also say, you know what? I don't want to do that. I just want to do nothing. I want to sit. I want to lay. Yeah. I just want to be. And that has been a remarkable, it's just been a remarkable skill that I have developed over the last 2 years or so. And it's taken longer than 2 years to build it, but
Right.
you know, when you want to create that as a default, you've got to want to not do the other things, like overthink. You've got to be able to justify the necessity for it.
Right.
And most people are not ready for that. I don't think most people haven't gone through like you have gone through the psilocybin, you've been through the ayahuasca, and you've reprogrammed a lot of things. And if that's accelerated, awesome.
Right.
And now you've created a necessity for you to not have that anymore.
Right.
And now so you've created so much space for everything else that you want to do or be or identify yourself as. Now you have an opportunity to do that. I did that over 7 years now.
Right.
Right. And it's become, I went on a different path, obviously. I've never had alcohol. I've never done drugs. I've never done tobacco, anything like that. I've never done ayahuasca or any psychedelics or anything like that. This has been just thought, right? It's been reading, it's been learning, it's been listening. Words are my drugs in many ways, right? Like I get high on trying to understand words and respect the power of them. And so my thoughts have always been the transformative factor for me, but not everybody's like me.
Right.
Right. And so it's important, like as people kind of go through this journey, I think it's really important to not place limits, to say, I'll never be like Dylan, or I'll never be like Chris.
Right.
But also be realistic about as you step up the ladder of, okay, how can I accelerate this? And what's realistic, right?
Right.
I need to learn more, right? Because you didn't do this without learning something.
Right.
And it's also important to say, in the aftermath of like what you've done, like the ayahuasca and the psilocybin, like you step into doing the modalities, doing the work. We talk about that work, right? What is the fucking work? Well, it's the maintenance, right? It's like if you're an engine, you've got to be able to check your oil. You've got to check your transmission fluid. You've got to check all of the things that make yourself tick.
Right.
Thoughts, actions, beliefs, perspectives, ideas. You've got to be able to check those and hold yourself accountable. And to me, that starts with things like values, right? Like I have a core value system that is well defined. Like I understand what each value means. And then I understand the overuse, the underutilization, the overutilization. And that allows me to create boundaries of, I don't want to overutilize and I don't want to underutilize.
Right.
I want a middle. And that creates balance on many different spectrums. Does that make me perfect? No. So I also have the allowance of error, within me as a human. And so I learned to prioritize, like, do I want to prioritize perfection? No, then I need to stop thinking about being perfect.
Right.
And so it's learning how to be progressive, not perfect, learning how to be human, not a machine, and it's not going to make people comfortable. It's not going to make everything. I'm not going to be able to solve all my problems. And so obviously you see so much work goes into developing a way to think what you want, whether that's nothing or not.
Right.
And I'm sure that you can attest to that as well in your journey, because you're in a similar situation where you're building your own thoughts and what you want to do with them.
Yeah. And I think it was a lot of figuring out, okay, where does my thought process go? What, what do I think about throughout the day? For me, it's eating, it's food. It's 70% of my day is, and not in a bad way, like, oh, I want a cheeseburger. I don't crave that stuff anymore, but it's even just, man, what time do I eat? What time, what are we doing for dinner tonight? It's constant thought, and it wasn't until I started thinking back through like, okay, why why do I think that way? Why do I feel that way? And I had a really great, and I think a big part of mental health is friends. I mean, if you don't
support,
if you don't have friends that you can really have honest conversations with, I can't imagine before I had them. But I have a great friend named Brian. He's an Air Force vet, and he said, I don't think about food at all, like literally. And then the next day we talk daily. And the next day he said, I told my wife about you. And she said, I could see that, my thought process is about 70% too. And he's like, I don't ever think about eating, a steak or eating, a hamburger. And I was like, no, you got it wrong. I was like, I'm not craving the actual food. It's the full feeling. It's the being.
Yes.
I said, I can overeat eating healthy, eating gluten-free, dairy-free.
Yep.
I could overeat eating vegan if I wanted to. It's that feeling of fullness. And why do I crave that feeling? And I think it goes back to the finish everything on your plate. And, you had a bad day, come let mom make you a cake, or let me make, you know what I mean?
Right.
Let me make you a dessert, or, and it's that, eat, go ahead and eat up, big guy. And, all those things. And it's that.
How were you comforted as a kid?
Yeah.
If it was food, guess what? Yeah.
Yeah. So I had to start physically telling or mentally telling myself, you are loved. You don't need to eat. Like you're loved. Everyone loves you. You don't need to feel full. You don't need to always feel stuffed and miserable. And it wasn't until I started having those conversations with myself and really, you're essentially diagnosing yourself. Like you said, I don't need those diagnosis, and I've had plenty of them they told me at 16 I was an alcoholic, which I haven't touched alcohol in years, but it's about knowing yourself and understanding yourself and giving yourself enough grace to really learn what those things are, and then kind of addressing them, and working through them. But yeah, and I think a lot of that goes back, and it's something we don't talk about either, is I was always on the cusp of being overweight by Marine Corps standards. So if my wax weight was 209, and it was, because I still remember, I would walk around at 208 to 210. You know what I mean? So we got weighed quarterly. So every quarter it was where are you at? What's your weight? And if it's not where it's supposed to be, in theory, you could go to jail, I guess. I never saw it happen, but they were certainly going to screw with you at the very least. And then what does that do to me mentally? Like, what kind of relationship does that build with food? What kind of relationship does that build with eating healthy? Even if I was on a constant cycle of, okay, I can let off a little bit this next month or two, but I know going into that third month when it's time to weigh in, that I'm going to have to pay more attention to it and really reel it back in. I mean, even that's unhealthy.
That's yo-yo dieting, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I was always looking at a goal. And I mean, I got to one point where I was almost 400 pounds, and I was probably 400 pounds. I just chose not to weigh in.
Right.
And I lost it all. And then I kind of did the same thing. It was short term, if I can, I want to run this race, or I want to do a half marathon. I'm going to train for this. And it was all these short term goals, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to live my life this way because it makes me feel better. And it improves my mental state, because when my body feels good, it's just natural for my mind to feel better. Right. And it doesn't have anything to do with a weight or a number or how I look in a pair of shorts or a swimsuit, because who cares? I'm married with a bunch of kids anyways. It's about feeling good, mind, body, spirit. Otherwise, if you're never truly aligned, your mental state's never going to be right to your physical states, at least within close proximity. We're all a work in progress for sure. But
right. Absolutely. I may be in a position of recognizing how I've overcome trauma and overcome, my dad's suicide, my own suicide and all that thing, but I still got problems, man. Like I still, I just in the past year, right? I've lost my grandpa. I've lost a soldier to suicide, or well, not suicide, but accidental firearm. And we don't know, like it could have been an accident. It could have been suicide. We don't know. But he was my soldier in Afghanistan. It's a hard thing to do, a hard thing to deal with as a leader. I've lost babies to miscarriage. Now my wife's pregnant, where she's due in June. And, the struggle is because we've lost 3, it's like, are we going to get to June?
Right.
And that's like, I'm feeling it right now. Like it's a hard thing it's beautiful. It's beautiful to watch, but it's so hard to, are we going to get there? Like,
right.
Are we going to get to that finish line and see our baby for the first time? Like, cause I really hope so. It's a hard thing to wake up to every morning, to know, like, is she still alive? She's still going, and like next week, we're at 23 weeks right now. And next week is viability week. So if anything happens, like, she becomes viable outside of my wife's uterus. And it's like, it's comforting, but at the same time, like, that doesn't guarantee anything.
Right.
And so I still go through issues. I know a lot of people look to me and think like Dylan's like my goal, right? Like,
right.
I have, like, for some reason they think I am perfect. I'm not, right? I still struggle through things. I still struggle through grief. What I do know is that even going through all of what I've been through in the last 2 years, I've never thought about suicide.
Right.
And that's a fucking win for me.
Yeah.
Right. That's a huge win for me. And looking at my life and recognizing what I came from and realizing that I went through, multiple losses of things that were very valuable to me, so important to me. And yet I still want to live. Right. And I've built a structure around me that is important. Right. And not only just my wife, my son, my family, my friends, all the people that I connect with, but me. Right. At the core of all of it, it's me. Like I have respected myself enough in the last 7 years to realize that if I didn't develop self-appreciation, I wouldn't be here.
Right.
And that's huge. Does that negate the fact that you're going to suffer? No, it does not.
Right.
It simply allows you to understand that you can suffer.
Right.
And still live and still survive. And you will have to survive some things to learn how to love the rest of your life.
Right.
And it's a profound thing to hear your story and listen to you talk about what you've been through and realize, like, there's so many different paths to the same outcome, and it's a beautiful thing to see, because that's what I want. I don't want people to just find me and be like, I got to follow Dylan's path. Right. I don't want that.
Right.
I want you to just see one outcome. And then I want to connect you with guys like Chris that can show you there's so many different ways to get there.
Yeah.
And
that's really what it's about. It's about, it's funny because I had a buddy of mine that asked me, what are you searching for? Like, why are you going to Peru? What are you searching for? And I said, I'm not searching for anything. Like, I've got everything I need. But it wasn't until after I got back and I told him, I said, I was trying to figure me out. I was just trying to unlock the puzzle of me and why. And I look back 5 years ago and think, what was I thinking in that moment? Like, what was my thought process? Like, what was going through my head?
Yeah.
And was I really even thinking about it, or was I just reacting and going?
Yeah.
And it's weird to think about that I might have been that way, where I just really didn't put the thought into it. I just kind of reacted and went. But yeah, I told him I was looking for figuring me out. And that's the greatest gift. I mean, to be able to sit in your own head and be okay with it is huge. I mean, it's just, right. And even if you have those struggles, knowing that, okay, I know what this struggle is and I know how to process through this and I know kind of how to let it flow through me, and then work through it, and then kind of deal with it and put it where it needs to go. It's a huge accomplishment. I mean, to me, it's no different than, going in and finally hitting that bench press, or finally hitting that max squat. I mean, it's a huge accomplishment that pays dividends,
Right.
tenfold.
Yeah, I would say it's even more powerful, because like you're probably never going to hit that bench again. Like if that's your best throughout your life, you're never going to hit it again.
No.
Right. Like that's what people don't really understand, is that I look at life as like climbing Mount Everest, right? You go up, you go back down, you go back up, you go back down, you go back up, you go back down, you go back up, you go back down, right? Because you're going to different base camp levels to acclimatize yourself. And eventually you get to the top, right? And your life climaxes. You get the best part of you, and you never know where that is. Like it could have already happened for some people, right? It could have already happened for me. Maybe like my life goes downhill from here. I don't know. But what are you going to do with the rest of your life after that climax? Right. Is because you hit your climax already, because you hit the pinnacle of your life, are you going to give up? Or are you going to come down? Are you going to live the rest of your life and understand that, are you going to look back and always miss the pinnacle, always miss what's up on top of that mountain? Or are you going to walk back down and see the beauty of the valley that you're walking into?
Right.
The beauty of the rest of the world, because you saw the heavens, but now you're in the riverbed. Like right. I look at it and very simply realize that it was never about the mountain. The climb is what taught you how to get to the top of the mountain.
Right.
And the climb down is the hardest part, because I've climbed a few mountains in my day. I've been to Afghanistan twice, right? Climbing down is always the hardest part.
Right.
And if you're not prepared for that, like it's a struggle for people, right? That second half of life, I've watched a lot of people go through it. It's a hard thing, especially veterans, right? Like right. It's a hard thing to live the rest of your life knowing that you'll never be that person again.
Right.
Some people live most of their lives realizing that they don't ever want to go back to that person. But then they realize that for the past 50 years, because of that mentality, that they've become someone they also don't want to be anymore.
Right.
And so it's such an interesting dilemma to face, right? To realize that, like the best parts of your life may be behind you.
Right.
But how do you create beauty in the second part of your life, or the next part of your life?
I think one of the big struggles that a lot of veterans have, and I know it's one that I dealt with, is it was always these big highs and these big lows. And so a lot of times we just forget to celebrate the little nuances, those little things, just the fact that I can stop during the day and just watch a bird fly across the sky. I mean, as lame as that sounds, being able to have an appreciation and think, wow, it's 70 degrees. I was in shorts and a t-shirt today. I mean, that's a gift when it was 18 degrees 4 days ago. And just those little wins, those, the sitting on the floor, my wife is, I guess, literally nesting because she has put floors down. We did a cacao ceremony. Have you ever heard of this?
I haven't.
Oh, so do you know what cacao is?
I don't actually. I feel like I've heard of it.
Okay, because it's chocolate. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So we did a ceremony with chocolate, and it was, I know people are gonna think I'm nuts. It was easily as powerful as the ayahuasca or the San Pedro, any other ceremony I've ever done. And it was literally just because my wife has 25 years sobriety, so she does not partake in plant medicine, but obviously cacao is fine. And so we did it Sunday night with a shaman came to the house, and we did the ceremony. And it was, because the way it was explained is the cacao is really high in magnesium. And so the magnesium essentially opens up your heart And so that's how they describe it, that it's very heart opening. And that's the only way I can describe it. Yeah. If you ever have a chance and you're called to it, it's just you drink basically 2 glasses of pure chocolate, but you can feel it move through your body and surround that magnesium, surround your heart.
Interesting.
It alters you.
I have 2 things I want to say. One, I want to go back to like the bird thing, because you said something about like just looking at a bird. No shit. Today, there's a window right behind this camera, and right up above the window is a massive hickory tree. And for the past like 3 or 4 weeks, I've had it must be a mating pair of I think they're red-tailed hawks.
Nice.
And one of those hawks came up and just sat on a branch right in front of my window, and I just like. I had to stop and just watch that bird, because like I have a massive affinity for hawks and eagles and stuff like that. And I just like, wow, like I literally stopped and just watched that bird for about 2 minutes. And it was just like it's just the coolest experience to just watch that animal just do what it does, just live. And it's like, I've never seen any hawks around our neighborhood until now. We've lived here for about 3 years. So it's a really cool experience to see that. And that reminded me of it. But I have a question for you in terms of like that experience, that cacao experience. I've always thought, and I'm going to give you a little bit of context. I've always thought like faith is a really powerful thing in terms of humanity, almost necessary. And when I refer to faith, I don't necessarily mean faith in God, although that's part of it, right? Like if you have a faith in God, you have faith. But there's faith in no God, right? Atheism. There's faith in science, right? There's faith in, plant medicine, right? Do you feel like your openness and your faith in things like plant medicine, in things like these journeys, do you think that has been a factor in opening yourself up to things like, like cacao, right? Like some people would probably drink that and be like, this is fucking weird. This is stupid. I won't do this. But like, do you think it's that openness to be that, to have that faith in that has been a part of you doing something that you felt where other people won't?
Yeah. And I think it brings up a valid point. And the 2 things that we talk about almost every time plant medicine's brought up is setting and intention. And the difference between doing LSD at 16 in high school is there was no setting, there was no intention, right? There was nothing behind it. And now when I go into ceremony, it's specifically for something. It's not recreational. It's to try to achieve a result. And in that ceremony, the intended result was just a closeness with my wife. But I 100% think, because you set that intention and because you believe in that intention, that you basically manifest it to come true. So if I went into it and said, this is nothing, it's like drinking a Nest quick chocolate drink, then that's what I'm going to get out of it. But if I really believe, and I mean, I had people that have journeyed too many times to count that said, wow, it's actually really profound. And I think when you get to that headspace of where you can appreciate that medicine is medicine and that's what it's being treated for, then I think through intention, you can really make it do anything that you want it to, or anything that it can do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's really, it's interesting in a way. Like now I'm kind of thinking more grand, not, like outside of plant medicine, but like thinking about like, especially like trauma and dealing with like mental health issues like depression and anxiety and PTSD, and how we're prescribed medicine. It's interesting to imagine how we actually perceive the medications that we take for things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And does the same like faith in the intention of that use like function in how we actually utilize medications like that. Like if we don't believe in them, do they actually work? And if we don't believe in them, are they destined to fail? It's like that placebo effect has always been studied by people, by scientists, and it's always been found that people will take the placebo and create an experience out of it. It's really interesting to think about that.
Well, to your point, I mean, it was, we went on a men's retreat. We all did the same amount of ayahuasca, the same amount of San Pedro. We did Cambo as well. We all went through the same protocol. Why was everyone's result not the same? I mean, and again, it goes back to perspective, right? I mean, I will tell you, I had a profound experience, but there were a couple of guys that were like, yeah, that was great, but they weren't going home and saying that was a profound experience. But I do know that my intention going in, because I took it so seriously and because I was going to spend that many weeks away from my family and away from my business, I did take it very seriously. So I went in and did a 30-day dieta. I went in and, didn't eat certain things, no cannabis, nothing else 30 days prior, so that I was clear and that I was prepped and that my intention was really set. And then I went in, I actually had journaled what I wanted to accomplish over those 3 weeks and set those intentions. And I hit some and I didn't hit others.
Yeah.
Some of them didn't get addressed and I'm still working on those things. But yeah, anytime we've done ceremony, it's definitely, you are setting the intention. And I agree. I mean, it could be over the counter medication, or it could be, now I think it's still going to work because it's still medicine, but I 100% don't think you'll get the same. You may not get the same result. You'll never know.
Yeah.
But you'll always wonder.
The counterfactual kind of argument of like, if I didn't take this medicine, how would I feel? Versus, if I take this medicine, you'll never know. It's an interesting thought though,
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Absolutely.
Well, I hate to cut this short, but
no, you're good.
I got other things to do. And like I said, I feel like there's a part 2 coming to this episode. I feel like we're going to connect fairly soon. We'll probably set something up after.
Yeah, because I still have, what's funny is I got a new tattoo, and it says, you probably can't see, it's a little dark in here now, but it says Tranquilo. And that's kind of been my thing, is just calm. And I was supposed to skydive last week and it got pushed because of weather. And then I was supposed to do what they call the God molecule, which is 5-MeO DMT, which is the one that they say is they call it a quote ego killer, that it kills your ego. So you come out a different person. So once those things happen, we'll have to see if there's another perspective shift, and see what that looks like.
I'm fascinated. This has been great, Chris. This has been, I love what's amazing about this is like, would I ever do what you do?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
But I love having the conversations around it and seeing like, what was your experience like? And, it's in many ways it's anecdotal, but it is what it is, right? The science will follow the anecdotes, right? And if the more people kind of dig into these anecdotes and understand like, this is a story that's real, right? Like, Chris, I don't feel like you're lying to me. So I'm pretty sure this is pretty truthful stuff that's coming out of you. So I'm going to trust you. And that means that at some point people are going to test it. People are going to dig into it and learn, why does it work? And like you said earlier, in 10 years, we're going to be talking about this stuff a lot differently.
Right.
And I'm really excited for that. I'm really interested in seeing where this stuff goes. Definitely excited to see where you go. And definitely excited to have you come back and talk about more experiences.
Yeah.
But before we do that, gotta ask you the last question. And I know you've been thinking about it.
Right.
So here it is. If there was a message you could leave the world, what would it be?
That no matter how fucked up you think your thought process is, somebody else, and chances are somebody really close to you,
thinks that same way. So start talking about it, because the more you talk about it, the more normal it becomes and the easier it is to discuss and the less cumbersome and the less weight you carry having it within you.
Perfect. That's great. That like perfect. I don't even want to dilute that with talking about that. That's absolutely perfect. I love it. Chris, thanks for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was amazing. I fully expect this isn't going to be the only conversation. We'll probably have a lot of them offline.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure,
I think this is going to kindle a friendship for sure.
Absolutely. Chris, again, thank you. For those of you who have listened for, I don't even know, it's probably an hour and a half at least, almost 2 hours. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're subscribed if you don't, so you can see Chris again or listen to Chris again, wherever you're watching or listening to this. And we'll catch you next time on the Dylan Experience. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Dylan.